Government is the problem.
In 1987, Reagan made Greenspan the most powerful banker in the world, the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Greenspan was a believer in Ayn Rand, a believer in free market. A little bit curious for a central banker, because what is central banking? It's a massive intervention in the market, setting interest rates.
Greenspan worried about this contradiction in his autobiography.
I knew I would have to pledge to uphold not only the Constitution, but also the laws of the land, many of which I thought were wrong.
Now the Vice President will swear Alan Greenspan in as the third.
He swore the oath and took the job.
I had long since decided to engage in efforts to advance free market capitalism as an insider, rather than as a critical pamphleteer.
He understood that there were laws he had to enforce that he personally would not have passed, but he intended to do as little as he could on regulation, and he proceeded to do just that.
We were attacked for losing money. We've been attacked for making money.
The world's most powerful man is on the defensive. Smear and innuendo have laid siege to the Clinton White House.
With recent news reports about the First Lady's cattle futures earnings and with all the whitewater allegations, many of us Americans are having a hard time with your credibility. How can you earn back our trust?
First of all, I've not been accused of doing anything wrong.
Bill Clinton's accusers may lack credibility, but not effectiveness. Thanks for joining me. The president is in trouble. Accusations of serial womanizing and shonky financial dealings are steadily eroding his public standing. The mud is beginning to stick. The President and the First Lady have already had to endure private grillings from a special investigator over the Whitewater affair. Soon they face open congressional hearings probing wider financial dealings in the Clintons' home state of Arkansas. Dealings which for Australians bear an uncanny resemblance to the WA ink scandal. The ABC's Washington correspondent Tony Jones went back to Arkansas to meet some of the extraordinary entrepreneurs now coming back to haunt the President. Tony Jones' report also sheds light on some of the shady characters behind the accusations, which now even run to drug smuggling and gun running by former Clinton mates.
In 1992, the most powerful office in the world was won by the governor of an obscure and impoverished southern state, who promised America a new deal.
A country of boundless hopes and endless dreams, a country that once again lifts its people and inspires the world. Let that be our cause, our commitment, and our new covenant.
The American public knew surprisingly little about the man they sent to Washington.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Bill Clinton had come from out of the blue to end 12 long years of Republican rule that seemed to have entrenched the right in power.
Congratulations.
Let us resolve to reform our politics so that power and privilege no longer shout down the voice of the people. Let us put aside personal advantage so that we can feel the pain.
The campaign against Clinton centres on Arkansas, his home state, and his past associates there. Amongst them is a man whose actions have embroiled the president in scandal.
35 going once. Going twice. So to Bill.
Once a millionaire banker and land developer, Jim McDougall has fallen hard. Stripped of his assets and crippled by illness, his doomed run for Congress is a deliberate mockery of his enemies.
I would like to introduce Clark County's candidate for the 4th Congressional District, Jim McDougall. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
It's odd in the extreme that the president's fate should be tied to that of Jim McDougall. But this is the man who brought the Clintons into the tangled web of the Whitewater land deal.
So I will say to you that the hour of your destiny has struck. Whether this party goes on to greatness or to failure lies in large measure in your hands.
The prevailing scuttlebutt about the Clintons' finances invariably leads us to this stretch of water. This is the White River in Arkansas, one of America's best for trout fishing. On land here, the young Clintons went into the real estate business with Bill's old friend.
You can see how beautiful it is. It's one of the most remote parts of the state. And in the 1970s, a lot of people were moving from the Midwest, people were retiring into pretty elaborate retirement communities throughout these mountains.
Ernie Dumas, the former editor of Arkansas's best newspaper, was our guide downriver to Whitewater. There's at least one retirement home nestling in the trees on the Whitewater development. And 16 years later, most of the lots have been sold, but too late to have bailed the Clintons out of a bad deal. Why would the Clintons have trusted Jim McDougall to invest their money?
McDougall, of course, was a friend, and until that point had had a lot of success at real estate development in the mountains. He had bought some, I think about 1,200 acres of undeveloped land. Lots were selling everywhere in the mountains during the early part of the 70s. But, you know, as I say, this was precisely the wrong moment in history because interest rates were rising dramatically. If you remember back in the late 70s, under Jimmy Carter, interest rates rose to 21%. People were not borrowing money for this kind of thing, and he was having to borrow money.
And so were the Clintons. They were now locked into a $203,000 loan with Jim McDougall and his wife Susan. It gave them a 50% interest in a losing proposition, the Whitewater Development Corporation. This happened on the eve of Bill Clinton's first run for governor. Needing money for campaigning, he was losing it in Whitewater.
I, Bill Clinton, do solemnly swear. Do solemnly swear. That I will support the Congress.
It didn't stop him, though. In 1979, at the age of 32, he became governor of Arkansas.
I haven't given a lot of thought to being the youngest governor in the country, and I never think about it unless someone else brings it up. I'm trying to be the best, not the youngest.
That same year, Jim McDougall bought himself a bank, Madison Guarantee, and soon afterwards started paying off the governor's part of the Whitewater loan. Investigators are now trying to determine whether he expected or got anything in return.
Let's shorten it up. This is wearing me out. I mean, really.
The allegation, though, is that you were effectively protecting them from financial loss.
Yes, that's true. That's what I've said throughout.
You were protecting them from financial loss?
Yes.
Taxpayer-guaranteed funds were in all likelihood used to benefit the campaign of a former governor.
Even more damaging is the Republican allegation that McDougall funneled money from his bank into the Whitewater Corporation and then into Clinton campaign funds. Betsy Wright was one of the most powerful figures in a succession of Clinton governments. His chief of staff through the 1980s, she managed all his campaigns during that time.
I would know better than anyone because I did supervise every single check that ever was put into a deposit for a Bill Clinton campaign up until the 1990 campaign, and I can guarantee that did not happen.
But on the floor of Congress, the Republican Jim Leach made precisely that allegation, that money had come from Madison through Whitewater and ended up in the campaign funds.
He made it up. Somebody made it up. It's not, there's no basis in fact.
In 1978, Hillary took the family finances in hand. Through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, she began gambling in risky cattle futures trades. In just 10 months, she made $100,000, having put up only $1,000. Her trades were handled by one of their best friends, Jim Blair, who also worked for Arkansas's biggest industry, Tyson's Foods. But now that her trade gambles have been made public, another of her former brokers in Little Rock is feeding suspicion about how she did it.
It is a stretch of the imagination for me to believe at this point that she could have taken $1,000 and made $100,000 with it.
Is it just impossible to do that, to make that sort of money with $1,000?
It wouldn't be impossible, I guess, totally impossible, but I don't see under any conditions where a person could.
Look, pass it. I swear I didn't know this was going to happen.
Some of these.
As their 70s investments return to haunt them, the President and the First Lady have tried to explain themselves.
You come back here, we got to answer questions. They're not through with us yet.
Treating the American people to the unique spectacle of their leading family exposing their financial affairs live on national television.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
It was left to the President to detail their relations with Jim McDougall in Whitewater.
You know, he's always told you that I had nothing to do with the management of Whitewater, that Hillary had nothing to do with it.
I stopped trading in July of 1979.
And in Hillary Clinton's case, to open for scrutiny the details of her futures trading.
There isn't any evidence that anybody gave me any favorable treatment.
Back at the beginning of the greedy 80s, while Whitewater lost money and Hillary made it, Governor Clinton infuriated big business in Arkansas. He took on the timber industry for its widespread clear felling. He took on the truckers and the power company. His radical team seemed a threat to almost every industry in Arkansas. And sure enough, most gave heavy backing to his opponent in 1980. Including Tyson's Foods, a fact overlooked by those who believed that Hillary's windfall was an indirect payoff from the poultry giant. Frank White, a Republican businessman bankrolled by his business colleagues, was about to teach Bill Clinton the most fundamental lesson of his political career.
I'm going to walk out of the room tonight a winner.
I regret that I will not have 2 more years to serve as governor, because I have loved it. I have probably loved it as much as any person who ever had this office.
The young governor was devastated. He'd wanted to change the world, and big money politics had beaten him. Before the next election in 1982, Bill Clinton had publicly repented.
And I'll have to admit, sometimes I did lose the forest for the trees, but it was a mistake because so many of you were hurt by it, and I'm really sorry for that.
The reborn Bill Clinton swept back into the governor's office in '82. This time he had no intention of giving it up.
I have been given something that few people get in life, a second chance to serve the people.
In the next decade, Bill Clinton would strike his deals with industry. He'd build a reputation as the governor business could talk to.
Bill Clinton doesn't have a personal fortune, but he's close to plenty of people like Don Tyson who do and would help him raise money.
To make Arkansas a model state for democratic business solutions. By the time he ran for president, he was famous for it.
Our wages are higher, our factories are busier, our water is cleaner, and our budget is balanced. We're moving ahead.
Now, the relationship Clinton had to his state's business elite is under intense scrutiny. This is Arkansas's scaled-down version of the Capitol building in Washington, and it's from here that Governor Bill Clinton launched himself into the presidency. Since then, his home state has become a scandal mill, churning out one damning allegation after another about his personal finances, his sex life, and the one-party state he ruled for more than a decade. Beyond Whitewater, he's accused of creating a sort of Arkansas Incorporated, giving tremendous business advantages to the so-called Friends of Bill, who were then expected to kick back into his campaign funds.
What we see in Arkansas is really backdoor connections, conflicts of interest, friends helping friends, and really a small group of cronies running the state for their own personal, political, and financial gain.
Roy Drew's not too happy about the last part. He's a stockbroker and one of a handful of vocal critics against what he sees as a state oligarchy.
The way the state has been set up, it is almost like a rigged card game.
In 1985, Bill Clinton decided to bring Wall Street to Main Street. He created a new agency that sold tax-free bonds guaranteed by the state to finance industry. Much of America was built on bonds, but Clinton's idea was to give the state more control.
ADFA.
It was called the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, and while it boosted business, it made him enemies amongst those who thought it smacked of socialism.
ADFA became a conduit from which Bill Clinton could peddle influence.
I think you've also described it as a cash cow.
Among other things. I've used cruder terminology on occasion, but I've used a piggy bank.
It was set up to provide loans to the people Bill Clinton wanted loans to go to, and that was it.
Another critic is Larry Nichols. Larry has been a regular guest on radio shows since he started making his allegations about the ADFA. He was the authority's marketing director in 1988.
Well, no, sir. I was there probably in February of '88, and I left September of '88. When I went to work at ADFA, I realized very soon that I was in the middle of the good old boy political machine that had been around Arkansas for over 100 years. This was the epicenter. They were building their own little world and using their own little piggy bank to do it.
Sheffield Nelson. Good to see you. I appreciate your vote. I hope you'll consider me.
The third arm of the Little Rock network feeding the press on this subject is Sheffield Nelson, a millionaire Republican running for governor and an old adversary of Bill Clinton.
Hi, how are you? They have run essentially a one-party state. They've had a political machine operating, and we're finally beginning the process of dismantling it.
I think there's some serious questions about the Arkansas Development and Finance Authority. First and foremost, it seemed to be a piggy bank for Bill Clinton's campaigns.
The repeated catchphrases echo in Washington to be regurgitated by Floyd Brown for a wider audience.
Many of his campaign contributors were receiving huge loans from ADFA. And I think that the governor personally was involved in approving those loans.
With the result that at the other end of the media's food chain, the ideas of Little Rock's Gang of Three, when swallowed whole, emerge in articles like this in the respected New Republic. The Poisoned Rose, described as a political thriller, put the conspiracy theory in print. It outlines a web of connections between the ADFA, Stevens Incorporated, the family-owned investment house that dominates the Little Rock skyline, the Worthen Bank, also controlled by the Stevens family, and the establishment Rose Law Firm, which, as well as the First Lady, sent 3 of its ill-fated senior partners to join the Clinton administration in Washington. Since much of the theory was his to begin with, Sheffield Nelson is happy to elaborate.
I think that Clinton was able to use Stevens and the Rose Law Firm, and they all benefited. I think that also just the placement of bonds generally throughout the state of Arkansas, Stevens has dominated that market. So there's no question but what Stevens and Clinton are in bed, and for anybody to say anything to the contrary, it's just not true.
We have not been supportive of Clinton, and we're not supportive of Clinton throughout much of the 80s.
The general notion is of Arkansas Incorporated, a state run for a small group, a business mafia.
Well, I just disagree completely with that. I mean, it's an absurd notion. We oppose the creation of ADFA. We've never, I mean, we certainly haven't benefited from it, and you know, there's just no basis for that.
It's time, perhaps, to question the motives of Clinton's critics. First, Roy Drew. He believes Stevens' corporate power has created financial victims.
Yes, I know one very intimate myself.
He once worked for Stevens Incorporated. Now he's feuding with it.
Sheffield Nelson. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Sheffield Nelson, too, was an executive at Stevens Incorporated before he fell out with the family over a complex deal.
They were bitter because I wouldn't play ball with them.
I understand that they never forgave you for your perceived treachery.
Sometimes it's best to not be forgiven by people such as that.
While I was there, I found out that I had actually gotten in the middle, the epicenter of Bill Clinton's political machine.
And what of Larry Nichols?
Larry Nichols is a longtime ne'er-do-well who was hired to work on communications or something at ADFA. I don't know. I was stunned to find they'd hired him.
But not for long. Nichols was sacked by Bill Clinton when he was caught using his office phone to raise money for the Nicaraguan Contra rebels.
I told Bill Clinton in 1992 that we were going to meet at high noon and one of us is going to get out of town. And I assure you and all your listeners, just like I did with ABC, NBC, and everybody else, we're going to meet. One of us is lying.
I never get love. You better let love depart.
It might be comical were it not for the fact that it was Larry Nichols who brought nightclub singer Jennifer Flowers to the public during the presidential campaign.
Yes, I was Bill Clinton's lover for 12 years.
Larry Nichols' sleaziness seems to know no bounds. He says he's auditioned many other women who claim to have had sex with Clinton, and he has a test to gauge their truthfulness.
3 points. And I've used them all the way through. Had a mole on his butt, had a fetish for oral sex, and had an extremely small penis. And I know that's gross. But in every case, as I would interview women, there were the ones that had and the ones that had not. And there was one other one that I don't tell anybody, which is the tiebreaker.
He has no credibility, he has no integrity.
These are very grubby stories, aren't they, some of them? Would you...
Complete sleaze. Complete sleaze.
Are you absolutely convinced that then Governor Clinton had nothing to do with the women that are making these allegations?
Absolutely.
Jennifer Flowers on down?
Absolutely.
Despite their transparent motives, Clinton's enemies have had their victories. Congressional hearings are pending, and in Arkansas, FBI agents are sifting through a growing list of accusations. Polls, meantime, show that people's trust in Bill Clinton is declining. That the occupant of the White House can be damaged by this sort of personal animus and small-town scandal mongers has steadily eroded the dignity of the office of president. But even if you put to one side questions of Bill Clinton's personal morality, there was something rotten in the state of Arkansas in the 1980s, something which Governor Clinton may have had limited knowledge of, but which during his tenure corrupted his state, undermined its law officers, and made a mockery of its judicial system. It's a story that goes back to Bill Clinton's attempt to fund industry through the state's bonding business. In the free-flowing financial climate, Little Rock bond traders flourished. One of the most successful was a flamboyant millionaire named Dan Lassiter. Lassiter's past relationship with Clinton could now be extremely damaging for the president. For Lassiter was a big campaign fundraiser until he was jailed on cocaine charges in 1986.
Dan Lassiter said that he had a corporate plane on which Bill and Hillary flew on occasions, and he said he regularly served cocaine on those flights, regularly held parties and served cocaine, and he said it was just a part of doing business. And among those people who he did business with the most were the president and the first lady.
Dan Lassiter had been known in the area. I mean, it was no secret that he was big into cocaine, had wild, lavish parties with cocaine. And he was the person selling the original bonds at ADFA.
Dan Lassiter was a competitor. We didn't think he was a particularly good competitor. And we didn't like the fact that he was interjected into a lot of issues.
Did you think there was a peculiar relationship between Lassiter and the Clintons?
Well, I wouldn't say it was peculiar. I think it was obvious that they were friendly. We felt like that was one of the main reasons they became involved as an underwriter in a lot of these issues.
Because
they
of
were
Lassiter's
friendly.
relationship with Bill Clinton?
Absolutely.
He was not close to the Clintons. He was a supporter of the Clintons. I think he was close to Clinton's brother, and probably knew his mother better than he knew Bill.
He loved singing the hymns and the gospel music. And
Lassiter's friendship with Roger Clinton became a political liability. The younger Clinton worked for Dan Lassiter until he too was arrested on cocaine charges.
My brother has apparently become involved with drugs, a curse which has reached epidemic proportion and has plagued millions of families in our country.
Although under investigation in the same case, Dan Lassiter was still making big deals with the state government.
This is a person that no governor in his right mind would be seen in public with or would open their door to.
Now, Republicans on the crucial Banking Committee are trying to find out just how much money Lassiter funneled into Clinton campaigns and whether some of that was drug money.
Even while he was under investigation, Bill Clinton urged that his friend Dan Lassiter be given a $30 million bond issue.
We know that Republican investigators are talking to this man, for Dennis Patrick is carrying documents that might eventually help uncover one of Arkansas's dirtiest secrets.
You've actually got your trade documents with you? Yes, I have the originals, as a matter of fact.
Patrick is in hiding, so we brought him to meet us in Washington. He has evidence that Lassiter's company may have been laundering huge amounts of drug money. His knowledge has left him in fear for his life.
It's very frightening to know what may have happened to you. I mean, there's certainly a reason to kill a man for $100 million, or knowledge of $100 million.
His story really begins in Florida sometime in 1985. An old friend, Steve Love, then working for Lassiter, took him on an all-expenses-paid fishing trip on a private yacht and made him a proposition.
He wined me. He essentially dated me. He convinced me. The way he explained to me is he knew how to trade the stocks and bonds in an account that would make me money.
Did you have spare money to invest?
No, I didn't have spare money. He knew I didn't have spare money.
Within days, Love called to summon Patrick to Little Rock. He said he'd opened an account and made $20,000 for his friend, though Patrick hadn't put up a cent.
I would have taken rollerblades to Little Rock for $20-something thousand. You understand?
So how did you meet Dan Lassiter?
I think he was waiting for me. It appeared that he knew I was coming.
He knew about your account?
Yes. He was very knowledgeable of the account. He was very familiar with it.
At the time, Dennis Patrick was a lowly county clerk in Kentucky with assets worth less than $60,000. Years later, a Lassiter insider gave him the documents which show the trades the company made without his knowledge.
My wife has asked me time and time again, why am I keeping these things? I don't even know what they are. And I've explained to her, I don't know why I'm keeping them, but for some reason I did.
They show that trades worth tens of millions of dollars were being made in his name.
There's $11,700,000, and then there are $1 million, $5 million, $4 million, $2 million.
So here's another one here for $5 million. I mean, you were worth a lot of money in those days.
Well, on paper, obviously someone was worth a lot of money. It obviously wasn't me.
This man says he knows at least one major source of black money flowing into Lassiter and Company bond trades. In the mid-1980s, Terry Reid was a close associate of one of America's most prolific drug traffickers, Barry Seal. He says Seal and Lassiter were in business when he first met them.
Lassiter introduced himself as Barry Seal's investment banker at the time.
Who else was there?
Roger Clinton was in the company of the two, of course. At that time, Roger worked for Dan, in fact, was his chauffeur.
Roger Clinton, the president's brother?
Yes, Roger Clinton, the president's brother, was Dan Lassiter's chauffeur.
Reid says that Seal regularly passed on large sums of cash to Lassiter.
From what I observed, and from what Seal said, because he would typically arrive in town with a briefcase that he professed to either contain cash, or on a couple of occasions I actually did observe, did have cash in them. And he would be very security conscious in taking his briefcase down to Lassiter's to have it put on deposit. It seemed to be a very close-knit, secretive operation, and I always presumed it was a bond buying.
Despite his high profile, Barry Seal appeared to be immune to prosecution. He was flying regularly in and out of the country and had extensive facilities at the small airport in Mena, western Arkansas.
At that time, you had the IRS, the Arkansas State Police, the local police, the FBI, Customs, and others, all investigating or monitoring Barry Seal's activities. State police records say that he moved into Mena in 1982, and he brought a fleet of planes with him, and he was hauling cocaine into this country by the ton, and that's according to his own sworn testimony.
This was a CIA or government-run operation, provided government cover. We were not low profile ourselves. I based myself right out of this airport.
In 1984, Terry Reid became involved in a covert operation run by the CIA in Arkansas. He says he trained Nicaraguan pilots as part of an effort to support the Contra rebels. He was brought in by a man he knew as John Cathy.
Subsequently, I found out that John Cathy was actually a Marine Lieutenant Colonel named Oliver North.
I sought approval of my superiors for every one of my actions, and it is well documented.
At the time, Oliver North was working for the National Security Council and the CIA in secret operations to subvert the US Congress, which had made it illegal to support the Contra rebels in their fight against the Nicaraguan government. Reid says it was North who recruited Barry Seal to run the trickiest part, the shipment of weapons to the Contras. Did you actually see weapons being air freighted out of the country?
Yes, I've seen weapons being loaded into his aircraft, and I've even observed weapons being assembled from component parts.
Police surveillance photos at the time placed Reid at the Mena airport.
I probed a pilot that flew with Terry Reid and knows that he was involved in the operation.
In 1991, former Democrat Congressman Bill Alexander headed a joint investigation of the CIA's activities in Mena for the US Congress and the Arkansas Attorney General.
A number of the C-130s were used during the 1980s to transport small arms and munitions from Mena to support the war effort in Central America. And those same contract carriers would be used to bring drugs back to Arkansas.
The hub of the operation was the Mena airport, a staging point for huge military aircraft, which the townspeople welcomed as a boost to their local economy.
This would mean probably doubling the gross sales of the airport within the next 2 years.
The CIA's operation generated money all right, but not the sort people expected.
Money flows. Money laundering, a common occurrence, really to the point of being blatant, out in the open.
An investigator for the Federal Internal Revenue Service, Bill Duncan, tried to follow the money trail.
People on the street talking about it, people in the banks talking about it. A bank vice president walking down the teller line handing out stacks, $10,000. to get cashier's checks for the Seal associates.
It seems to me that you're talking about an operation sanctioned by a high government agency, the CIA, to smuggle drugs into this country.
There's no doubt in my mind that we have direct evidence that on order from the National Security Council, which was executed by the CIA, that drugs were smuggled into the United States for whatever purposes. And then those drugs found their ways into the bloodstreams of children in the United States.
Nobody was ever prosecuted. No one was ever indicted. And by that time, the risk was over.
The risk that the Central Intelligence Agency would be exposed, for example.
Right.
But you were put under tremendous pressure to prevent you from making these disclosures.
Excruciating pressure.
Drugs have a way of corrupting local officials, have a way of corrupting governments. There's certainly some corrupting influence in the state of Arkansas. We don't know the extent of that corruption. It needs to be discovered.
I believe that he had to know if the Central Intelligence Agency had an extensive operation over a number of years in the state of Arkansas.
If you had the opportunity to put your case to him now, what would you say to President Clinton.
Why didn't you, after these issues came to light, go direct to Washington and say, what's going on here? I don't like what I see happening in my state.
I don't know how he would have known it was a CIA operation, and governors don't get to tell the federal government what they do in secret operations.
It's up to us to change the future.
Bill Clinton's state was corrupted under his very nose by powerful elements within the federal government he now oversees. And there's evidence one of his closest business friends, Dan Lassiter, may have been laundering money for the illegal operation. The pilot, Terry Reid, now claims he knows why Clinton didn't act to expose the scandal. He claims he saw Governor Clinton at a meeting at Camp Robinson outside Little Rock when the operation was being wound down.
He seemed to be very agitated at the abrupt departure of the whole operation, and the residue it was leaving behind, I think, was his focus of his anger.
Reid has in fact written a book about the operation. In Compromised, he alleges Governor Clinton knew what was happening and that his administration was paid to turn a blind eye.
The confrontation was diffused by a promise that the CIA would get actively involved in short-circuiting the judicial process.
Not one person has corroborated Reid's account of the meeting. The story might be dismissed were it not for the fact that Reid's book is now on bestseller lists nationwide.
The book is so false as to be laughable. I mean, this man's fantasy level probably qualifies him for some kind of institutionalization. I pass mentally ill people on the streets and wonder if it's Terry Reid. This is pathetic, this person.
But the Lassiter connection does lead back to Washington through another of its Little Rock imports, Patsy Thomason. Now the Director of Administration at the White House, Thomason was the Executive Vice President of Lassiter and Company when the illegal trades were made.
When he went to prison, Pat Thomason took over the operation. Now, who is Pat Thomason? Well, she is also a friend of Bill's, and she's over at the White House right now on the White House staff. She was one that was in Vince Foster's office right after his death, cleaning out his desk.
Vince Foster was another old friend from Arkansas. He worked for the Clintons as a senior White House lawyer until he was found shot to death in July last year. Because of her presence in his office on the night of his death, Patsy Thomason is under subpoena from the Fisk inquiry, and until he reports, she's saying nothing.
Mr. Istook, I think the direction of this question is toward the Vince Foster episode, and I would decline, Mr. Chairman, to answer any questions with regard to that.
But she's a clear target for Republican cross-examination as they attempt to build a bridge between the president and Dan Lassiter's illegal doings. There's an inescapable irony about the fact that Bill Clinton may be smeared by what is essentially a scandal of the right, even you might say the extreme right. He's certainly not the first president to have had unsavory businessmen get close to him, nor the first to have embarrassing friends or relatives. Bill Clinton's problem is the extent and range of the scandals he's being dragged into. As each one unfolds, he faces a sort of death by 1,000 cuts. While the Fisk inquiry investigates in camera, the president will soon face open congressional hearings with a long and varied menu of Arkansas tales.
Oh, Arkansas, oh, Arkansas, Arkansas, USA. It's the spirit.
From the Rose law firm, he's haunted by the ghost of Vince Foster and the resignation and demotion of two other Rose partners whom he brought to Washington.
Oh, Arkansas, oh, Arkansas.
Then there's a Little Rock judge who's trying to save his own neck by saying the president is corrupt. From the business world he courted, there's Dan Lassiter and his old friend Jim McDougall. From the state's police force, his own security chief and sundry state troopers recounting tales of debauchery. and the women themselves lining up for retrospective revenge or simply lining their own pockets. Bill Clinton's character assassins are many and varied, and if none of them gets a clear shot, they'll each have a chance to wound him.
Arkansas, USA.
And by the time Bill Clinton took the White House, the anti-government rhetoric had become so fashionable that even some Democrats embraced it.
Ronald Reagan had won. Government was seen as the problem, and even though Bill Clinton was someone who believed in government and wanted to use it, he was kind of forced into that Reagan-esque ideology because that was what people wanted to hear.
From the beginning, Clinton aimed to reassure powerful forces on Wall Street. And he did so with a key appointment.
I asked Robert Rubin to serve as assistant to the president for economic policy.
Rubin is the best-known financier in the country at that point because he had run the legendary Goldman Sachs.
Bob Rubin was Bill Clinton's emissary to Wall Street. Clinton placed great trust in Bob Rubin and Bob Rubin's view of financial markets and financial regulation.
He had an enormous amount of credibility because he was a business success, and Democratic administrations always seem to worship people who can excel at business.
At the White House and as Treasury Secretary, Rubin found an unlikely ally. Clinton had asked Alan Greenspan to stay on.
Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan were very much in lockstep. They had very similar views on Wall Street. It boiled down to the less regulation, the better.
And Rubin populated the Clinton administration with a network of free market true believers.
It wasn't just Rubin and Greenspan who were these free market acolytes. That thinking pervaded the Treasury and the White House.
Among Rubin's acolytes, 35-year-old Timothy Geithner, and Rubin's top deputy, the outspoken Harvard economist Larry Summers.
Summers is tough. Summers is very blunt-spoken, doesn't suffer fools lightly or anyone else, as the saying goes.
Bob Rubin is not a guy who likes confrontation. He's confrontation averse. But he understands that you need someone in there who can swing a heavy axe. And that person was Larry Summers. He was the enforcer.
Together, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers formed their own pro-business, anti-regulation support group.
They're the committee to save the world, according to the Time magazine cover. These are the people we turn to at that moment, who together, all three in a way, say, trust us.
They seem to have things under control. You know, the world trusted Rubin and Greenspan, so why wouldn't Clinton? You know, and the market was doing great, and the country seemed to be doing great.
Tonight on Frontline, long before the economic meltdown, the story of one woman who tried to warn about the threat to the financial system.
She saw something that people either had not seen or refused to see, and she tried to sound the warning.
What are you trying to protect?
We're trying to protect the money of the American public.
Before the toxic assets poisoned the economy, she warned of their danger.
And that made her the enemy of a very, very large number of people.
She would fight an epic battle with one of the most powerful men in Washington.
It got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Greenspan turns to her, she turns to him. His face is red,
and he's clearly quite upset.
A story from inside the highest levels of the Clinton administration.
They were all part of a very concerted effort to shut her up and to shut her down. And they did, in fact, shut her up and shut her down.
Tonight on Frontline, Alan Greenspan, Brooksley Born, and The Warning.
A Florida woman had her own fight with a bank, and this week we learned that Lynn Simoniak will be paid $18 million for uncovering a massive foreclosure fraud. On Monday, 4 top banks agreed to pay $95 million to settle charges that they used fraudulent paperwork in thousands of foreclosures. Simoniak discovered the scheme while fighting her own foreclosure. It was in 2008 that Lynn Simoniak got her foreclosure notice. In the first court appearance, her bank said that it had lost her paperwork. The case wasn't going anywhere until the bank came back to court a second time. They found all of your paperwork more than a year after they initially said that they had lost it.
Yes.
Did that seem suspicious to you?
Yes, absolutely. And what do you imagine? It fell behind the file cabinet? Where was all of this? We had it, we own it, we lost it, and then more recently, everyone is coming in saying, hey, we found it. Isn't that wonderful?
Simoniak is a lawyer with special training in spotting forgeries. She got a hold of the bank's newfound mortgage documents and saw that they were signed by a bank vice president named Linda Green. Next, Simoniak went online and looked at hundreds of Florida mortgage records.
Then I began to find the strange signatures.
She found Linda Green had many signatures, and Green was a vice president at a lot of banks, all at the same time. Green had signed thousands of documents.
All within the same week. I mean, this is a very, very active person.
In a 60 Minutes investigation, we tracked the Linda Green paperwork to a document mill here in Georgia. So you're Linda Green?
Yes. Can't you tell?
Chris Pendley showed us how he and other low-wage employees signed documents as Vice President Linda Green. Simoniak had discovered a secret. Back when the banks were making a fortune churning out mortgages, the paperwork was sloppy. When the foreclosure wave hit, a lot of that paper was missing, and that's what the document mill was trying to replace.
In my mind, this is an absolute intentional fraud.
Simoniak filed a whistleblower lawsuit on behalf of the federal government under the False Claims Act. Her $18 million is a percentage of the money that the government recovered.
Just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to lenders trying to speed or fraudulently foreclose in this country. But why would the banks be so anxious to behave this way? And why would politicians in the Treasury Department allow them to do it? Take a look.
Most mortgages are backed by the government. In order for a bank to get that sort of backing, it must fit 2 criteria. 1, borrowers must be verified by the banks and their agents as qualified. And 2, the lenders must fill out paperwork accurately and make sure that when the home's title changes hands, so too does the documentation. But during the past 2 decades, a whole lot of the time, that never happened. Why is that? For the banks, the motive's simple: money. Banks profited by packaging and selling those toxic home loans, and then profited again by betting against those same securities. A bet, in essence, that a fraudulent loan they made wouldn't be paid back. But why would politicians allow this? The simple answer: to stay in office. Giving people houses makes them happier and makes local politicians more popular. At the same time, the financial services sector, the banks making all that money, were donating to the political campaigns. In 2008, the financial sector was the top donor to both Democratic and Republican candidates. So where are all these fraudulent loans now? Well, you own them at the Federal Reserve, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. In order to cover it up, the banks and politicians will do whatever it takes to prevent a legitimate foreclosure proceeding, one that would easily reveal the lack of qualifications and bad documentations in the loans the banks have been selling and giving to the government for years. And finally, the last and most important why. Why isn't our government dealing with it now? perhaps because that would reveal systematic criminal and civil fraud at the highest levels of America's banks and political corridors.
And we know who's fighting for the banks with all the money going to our politicians. Again, from the president on down the line, no one has given more money to all of our politicians than the financial services industry. Question is, who's fighting for everybody else? And joining us now is Jennifer Brunner, Ohio Secretary of State. She's launched an investigation into the specific foreclosure proceedings in her state. And Carl Denninger, author of The Market Ticker, who caught my attention today with his fiery open letter to California Democrats on this very topic. He is also one of the founders of the Tea Party movement, going back to this original issue a few years ago. Jennifer, I'll begin with you. Can you give us a sense of what you see as the problem on the foreclosure side right now in your own state?
Hi, Dylan. I'm Secretary of State of Ohio, and I license the notaries in my state who notarize documents, for instance, for some of the home finance companies, the banks that are processing these foreclosure documents. What we're seeing is, for instance, 8 notaries notarizing 18,000 documents a month, and hearing stories that the notary's filling in information in the document, handing it to the signer, who's actually named as an officer of multiple banks and signing multiple documents to create a chain of title or a list of owners, and then the notary handing it back to the signer signing it, and the notary notarizing it. I don't have the authority to actually revoke these notaries or to prosecute, so I sent it to the Justice Department in August to have them take a look at it.
And have you heard back from them?
I've been in some contact, and out of respect for the Justice Department, I said that I finally called in late September and said, am I allowed to say anything about the fact I've referred it to you, and I was given the go-ahead.
Okay. Listen, Carl, I want to read everybody a little bit of an excerpt of this letter you wrote today. Very powerful. You say, this is clear evidence that these securities, the core of all the foreclosure and housing mess, are fatally defective. You say there is no solution to this problem that is both lawful and yet preserves the fiction that all is well with this edifice, yet at the same time protects the chain of title and housing and the rights of both homeowners and securities buyers. It's almost as if you're saying we can keep the system we have, but then we have to forfeit our sense of property rights in this country, or if we want to reestablish property rights in this country, we have to deal with the fraud or the malpractice that is at the core of this. Is that a fair interpretation, Carl?
Yeah, that's essentially the problem. I mean, what's happened here, Dylan, is that these people at the inception of all of these loans knew they weren't any good. We now have this. It's been discussed in FCIC hearings, and yet these securities were packaged into these specific types of conduits. The problem is the IRS regulations say you have to convey the paperwork, and in addition to that, there are specific standards for the amount of non-performing assets or things that you could foreseeably see a default on that can go into these structures. You can't get there from here when 30 to 90% of these notes are found not to be in conformance, and that's the testimony that we've had over the last 6 months. So you can't go back and unbreak this egg. It's already happened. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. We now have either a bunch of these structures that were put together with defective instruments, or the instruments were never conveyed in the first place, and because the dates have passed where you can add things into these structures, there is no fix for this without violating the tax preference. I don't know how you solve this problem. The only thing I can come up with is force this bad paper back onto the originators, repay the MBS holders who bought these things thinking they were good securities and actually bought an empty box.
I'm going to interrupt you a little bit just because we're dealing with, I want to make sure that anybody who's watching this can understand what it is that you're saying. The point is that the people who bought a lot of these toxic securities was your pension fund, the teacher's pension fund, the judge's pension fund, the police and firefighters' pension fund. And those pension funds were sold these mortgages on the belief and verification, both from the ratings agencies, from the banks, and implicitly from the government, that those loans were good. And when we find out that the loans were not good through these foreclosure processes that they're trying to avoid, you either have to pay back the pension that you've raped, or you have to ignore it and continue to drive the system the way that it's being driven, but that doesn't seem to be politically viable much longer. If you look at this, Jennifer, how much longer can we avoid dealing with the core issue of banks making money by selling non-conforming loans to the government by the trillion, and then going forward, betting on their collapse, and then donating the profits to politicians who say it's okay?
Well, this was part of the reason why I made the referral to the Justice Department. I knew this was happening across state lines, and I also knew that the notary issue was really the tip of the iceberg, that when you start to look at how sloppy the banks have been at keeping their chains of title in line. I mean, they ask consumers and tell consumers they have to follow the letter of the contract between the bank and the consumer, whether it's a credit card or whether it's a home loan. At the very least, the bank should have to follow the letter of the law. In this case, I knew that we would find situations where there was not only sloppy notarization, but actual lapses and gaps that really leave the final person who's bringing the foreclosure action in a position where it may not even be good, and where clearly you've got a homeowner who may want to find out who really is the party in interest, or have an attorney for them look into predatory lending, and it's very difficult to even get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, Carl, if you were to look at the core issue here, which is that the savings of America was the piggy bank that this type of product was being sold to, that the savings of America, whether it's the New York State pension managers or any, I go down, we don't have to list all the various pensions, are the ones that got stuck with a lot of this paper, not to mention Fannie, Freddie, and now the Federal Reserve. If you were to look at that core issue, and then you were to look at the understandable anger, not just from the Tea Party, which I know is a constituency that you were catalytic to at its beginning, but across the entire political spectrum, why do you think we haven't seen the organized focus from the Tea Party on this issue in a way that is effective, and for that matter, an organized focus from anybody else who's pissed off, whether they're a Tea Party or not, on this issue? Why do you think it doesn't get addressed politically?
Well, Dylan, you just got to look at this from the standpoint, you don't present false documents if you have real ones, okay? So the reality is the real ones are gone. They were intentionally obscured. And if you start to look at this, what if we find out that of the $6 trillion of securities that are out there outstanding right now, half or more of them are defective? You put them back on the banks, and they all blow up. You know what? We have a resolution authority under Frank Dodd. How about if we use it?
Can I leave it right there? Because I would love to see them use it, especially if this is all fraud. Jennifer Brunner, Ohio Secretary of State, Carl Denninger, author of The Market Ticker. I hope you'll both come back, and I hope that the two of you remain as vigilant on this issue of the compromising of property rights in this country as I intend to. And if you're watching this program, please take the time to either rewatch this segment, or if you can't believe everything that you have just heard, and you're interested in learning more about it, or have the opportunity to reread it, to understand it. I understand it is technical. I advise you to check out not only The Market Ticker and Carl's open letter, but a blog that I posted today to the front page of the Huffington Post that explains just how deep-seated this problem is in this country, entitled Property Rights Gone Wrong. That now atop the Huffington Post. If the banks have stuck a bunch of fraudulent loans with the Federal Reserve, Fannie and Freddie, and are trying to cover it up with foreclosure fraud, well, please let us see the Justice Department do something to defend the American people, as opposed to the largest banks in this country, for a start.